snow worried the air like ash as the last notes unfurled over the avenue, and the city, normally so incurious, leaned in. He was passing through noise, through headlines, and glass. Already late for a meeting meant to stitch his reputation back together, when the bow drew a sound that felt like the memory of a promise he had never kept. She played with a hunger that wasn't for applause, and the street answered with steam and neon halos. A cathedral made of scaffolding and breath. He stopped, annoyed at himself for stopping, and watched the melody name what he had spent years refusing to admit. Control was only a disguise for fear. When the case at her feet showed only a scatter of coins, he saw the fault lines of his own kingdom. He made the offer carefully, like diffusing a bomb. One night, a gala, an audience with teeth, and she weighed him with eyes that did not flinch. Music against money, truth against optics. The city held its breath for the answer. The ballroom vaulted like an ice cathedral, and the city's opinion makers gathered in glittering rows, all teeth and lenses, waiting to decide whether he deserved forgiveness or blood. She tuned in a quiet antechamber, hearing the crowd the way a sailor hears weather. And when she stepped into the light, the hush felt like a cliff. He stood near the back, breaking his own rules by watching instead of calculating, because calculation had brought him here, and her first note promised a different map. The melody braided the polished gloom with warmth, and faces that arrived hungry for a headline softened into people who remembered they were once loved. He felt the grip of his reputation loosen, not by strategy, but by mercy he hadn't earned. When the applause came, it was thunder through glass. In the echoes, he made a new promise he didn't yet understand. Tonight would not be the end of this. On the terrace, the city unspooled in light like a patient constellation, and the cold made the truth simpler. He offered gratitude first. Unrehearsed, imperfect. Then the thing that cost more. A second night, not for the cameras but for him. She traced the stone balustrade with a finger, weighing the hour's transformations against the arithmetic of need, and asked the only question that mattered. What exactly would she be to him after the last bow? He named terms and then, surprisingly, boundaries for himself. Promises to keep distance that sounded like wanting to be worthy. The wind lifted her hair and carried the ballroom's applause out to them like surf. She felt the tug of a life she had not permitted herself to imagine. When she smiled, it was an answer and a warning both. And he understood that power here would be measured by how gently it could hold. The power faltered. Not darkness exactly, but a blink long enough to reveal who in the room believed in control and who believed in luck. Lenses flared, whispers sharpened, and on the mezzanine a rumor burst like a flashbang, a leaked photo of them beneath the awning, her hand in his, already spun as scandal. He felt the old machinery roar to life, contain, deny, redirect, while she watched faces more than screens, reading fear like sheet music. She lifted the violin without instruction and poured calm into the air. The crowd tilted toward the sound as if balancing on it. He matched her with stillness, standing where everyone could see him choose not to run. The lights steadied. The rumor did not. Somewhere, a rival was smiling, but the room belonged to the note she chose to end on, one that promised there would be no purchase on her without her consent. After, the city's breath fogged the glass, and the night thinned to the hour when even ambition nods. In a quiet service corridor, he found her packing the instrument with a tenderness he envied, and offered the contract on paper the way old promises were made, ink that could be kept. She read while he waited, and the silence grew a spine. He realized he wanted her artistry near him, not as a shield, but as a mirror. She set a fingertip on a clause and changed it, crossing out language that made her an accessory, and writing in words that made her a collaborator. Something in him loosened at the sight of that insistence. When she agreed, once more night on her terms, he felt the trap of possession spring harmlessly shut on the floor between them. He was already thinking of all the reasons to let go. He also knew he wouldn't. Morning scraped the frost off the city with headlines sharpened to cut, and the night's music had already been repackaged into a story with teeth. He read the versions of himself they preferred: calculating, predatory, desperate, and felt the old armor itching to be worn again. She woke to a phone vibrating like a trapped bird, half the messages tender and half of them knives, and considered the price of a sound that had told the truth too loudly. The contract lay on the table like a compass that pointed wherever fear wasn't. He sent a message not to manage perception, but to ask if she needed coffee and quiet, which was a language he wasn't fluent in. She answered with a time and a cross street, and the insistence that this second night would not become a leash. Outside, snow clung to branches like static, and the city, ever hungry, waited to see who would blink first. They met in a cafe that smelled like butter and rain, and the glass fogged with the warmth of people trying to remember kindness. He arrived on time and unarmored. A small miracle he pretended was ordinary, and asked about the piece she'd play tonight instead of asking how to survive optics. She answered with titles, then with the stories inside them, and the air between them steadied. When cameras bloomed at the window like winter flowers, she held his gaze and didn't flinch, and he felt the architecture of his life shift a measurable degree. He told a story he rarely touched, of a boy who learned to be useful so he couldn't be left. She countered with a girl who learned to leave before anyone else could. It wasn't confession so much as permission. By the time the door opened to the swarm, they had decided to be seen on their own terms. The press breached like tidewater, questions thrown like hooks, each baited with the ugliest version of them. He almost answered the way he always did, polished, bloodless, until she lifted the violin case and gave the room a different route out. She asked if they'd prefer speculation or 6 minutes of something indisputable, and the audacity startled the noise into listening. He moved to her side not as a shield but as a witness, and when she drew the first note, the cafe thinned into a stage where generosity could be louder than gossip. His palms tingled with a wish he couldn't manage, so he kept still, choosing silence as a strategy he hadn't known he possessed. The last cadence landed on a hush that felt earned, and in it, a reporter lowered her camera, then asked a softer question. What did the music change? He said, simply, him. By evening, the city had metabolized the duet into 1,000 versions, some tender, most hungry, and the second night loomed with the weight of expectation. He moved through the event like a figure on a chessboard who had finally noticed the board was also a room with air and music, and a woman who refused to be used. She tuned backstage, hands steady, breath measured, and when he reached for words, he found only the kind that promised to stay out of her light. The crowd arrived sharpened by rumor, but the performance met them with heat, bending winter. He watched the arc of her bow carve a new story into the room, and understood that control could be an act of care if it meant arranging for beauty to happen, and then stepping aside. Applause struck like flint. Sparks caught. Outside afterward, the night wore its cleanest cold, and the city's pulse slowed to let them hear their own. A car idled with the heat running and a route planned, but they didn't get in. She asked what tomorrow looked like once the contract did what contracts do and ended. He answered with a map of choices that didn't require signatures. The truth they had tried to keep quiet stood between them, inconvenient and bright. Somewhere down the block a flash popped, and the rival who fed on scandal tasted fresh air. But the image captured would not be a man swallowing a songbird. It would be two people unafraid to be looked at. He offered to walk, not to follow. She nodded, not to lead. They moved in step, and the city, for once, seemed content to watch without deciding. Dawn staggered in with the taste of metal, and the city returned to its favored pastime, deciding other people's lives with certainty and speed. The image was everywhere. A hand near a hand under falling snow, eyes caught between trust and calculation, a frame cropped to imply possession. Phones sang with curated outrage. Investors adjusted their masks. The orchestra of judgment tuned. He faced a conference table lined with immaculate smiles, and memorized concern, while the story of the quarter migrated from balance sheets to bedrooms. She rode the subway with her instrument case for armor and counted the stairs that stuck like burrs. The temptation to shrink was heavy as a wet coat. Instead, she rehearsed scales against the noise until the noise learned her pitch. When they finally spoke, it was not to apologize for being seen, but to draw a line neither had drawn before. The truth would not be negotiated, no matter who tried to buy it. Midday brought the counter-move. A glossy blog with teeth bared wrapped its speculation in silk, implying a contract of a different sort and a price paid in something softer than currency. A clipped message arrived from counsel recommending distance, then another softer voice suggesting silence as a strategy. He knew the choreography: issue, deny, distract. Yet every step felt like erasing whatever had begun to breathe. She stood in a rehearsal room the size of a confession and tried to play without memory, only to find memory in the wood, in the Rosen's small galaxy, in the ache of wanting more than rescue. Outside, lenses pooled like winter puddles. He chose the narrow door and walked in without coat or entourage, and the room startled at the humility of that. They did not discuss the picture. They discussed agency, consent, the way a life grows crooked leaning toward someone else's storm, and the music loosened its fists in the corner. The first true fracture arrived with the couriered envelope, heavy stock that pretended to be honorable. Inside, a non-disclosure draft couched as protection but engineered like a muzzle, plus a generous check that glittered like a trap. He stared at the sum and saw an old habit. Solve discomfort with zeros, scratching at the door. She read the clauses and felt her pulse find a drum beat. That meant no. The refusal was quiet and absolute. The check returned uncashed. The draft returned, red-inked with a chorus of boundaries. He met with those who spoke the language of risk and realized they could not hear music. They could only hear leverage. When he left the room, he carried a smaller future and a clearer spine. They met in the streets, clean cold, and said what mattered with fewer words than a headline. This would continue only if both could look themselves in the mirror tomorrow. Evening drew a charity concert she'd agreed to long before any of this, a hall that smelled of polished wood and earnestness. The stage felt safer than rooms full of opinions, and for a blissful stretch there was only breath, bow, resonance. Then a projection appeared uninvited on the lobby wall. Grainy footage of a sidewalk handshake looped and enlarged until it looked like surrender. The crowd's attention split like a brittle branch. He could feel the carefully mended fabric of the day tearing, and the person behind it. She finished the movement with precision that tasted of salt, and walked into the lobby's cold light. Instead of retreating, she stepped between the screen and the people, body casting a small eclipse, and spoke the oldest truth. Art is not consent. Presence is not purchase. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It had teeth of its own, and it bit through the snare. Night deepened to the hour when trains run emptier and truths speak louder. At a bench that remembered better summers, they faced the unslept questions. What are we building, and what will it cost? He admitted the reflex to fix by owning the childhood that taught him safety wore a lock. She admitted the reflex to run the moment warmth felt like dependence, the years that taught her doors close when you hesitate. The city offered them no privacy beyond the cold, which was perhaps the only witness they needed. They made a pact without ceremony. Every decision forward would be asked, not assumed. Every headline would be answered with action, not performance. Somewhere, a camera failed to find them because they were not a pose but a practice. When they rose, it wasn't resolution that warmed them but the work of it, and they walked separate ways that still moved in parallel. Morning arrived like a subpoena, and the glass tower breathed a chill that wasn't weather. Screens bloomed with a new narrative, sleeker and crueler. A wire transfer threaded through a charity, an implication dressed as proof, the story of a patron purchasing a muse. He stared at the ledger and felt the ground tilt, because the donation was real. Approved months ago to keep instruments in children's hands, now diverted to a hospital account that was suddenly hers. The room of polished allies inhaled opportunism. Words like fiduciary and impropriety circled like hawks that had learned his thermals. The rival sat serene at the far end, smiling as if the outcome were a foregone conclusion. The only steady thing in the room was the quiet presence to his right, the one who knew where the bodies of Data lived. She tipped her tablet, and there it was. A reroute, a signature forged by software. They were being played. He was expected to play along. Across town, the fluorescent quiet of a clinic made every heartbeat sound like a verdict. A receptionist slid a statement across the counter with the word "paid" stamped in festive red, and relief hit like a tide before suspicion stripped it bare. She did the math, then the math behind the math, and felt her throat go winter dry. The temptation to accept mercy without question pressed its warm cheek against her shoulder. The lesson of a lifetime pressed back harder. Outside, gray snow melted into street grit, while the city rehearsed outrage on cue. Her phone vibrated with his name. She let it. When she finally answered, their voices met on the edge between gratitude and offense, and the air between them crystallized into something fragile and sharp. He swore he hadn't sanctioned this, and she believed the part of him that wanted to be better. She did not believe the system that wore his face. The ambush took the shape of weather. Sudden, everywhere, impossible to ignore. Outside the clinic, lenses multiplied like raindrops on glass. A rumor condensed into a storm. A document waved inches from her face. An agreement she had refused weeks ago. Now watermarked as if consecrated, her forged signature curving where she'd drawn a line through ownership. He arrived too fast, breath skidding in the cold, and the old choreography beckoned. Usher, shelter, silence. She sidestepped it, shoulders squared, and spoke with a poise the cameras hadn't bought. She would not be an anecdote in another man's myth, nor a cudgel in another man's war. He backed her like a lighthouse backs a shoreline, by standing where danger could see him. Questions ricocheted, accusations sought purchase, and the rival's car idled at the curb with a patience that read as victory. The truth, for once, was boring. Malpractice by design. Boring does not trend. She turned away anyway. Silence has timbre, and in the penthouse it rang like crystal threatening to fracture. He offered explanations the way he once offered solutions. Stacked, precise, nearly airtight. But the one seam that mattered let cold in. Intention against impact. She placed the case on a marble island and unlatched it without drama. The gesture as intimate as a goodbye. They spoke in the grammar of boundaries, every sentence loaded with childhood ghosts, his of locks and ledgers, hers of vacated chairs, and the room's view of a city blazing with verdicts made their words small and bright, like light matches. He promised to burn down the machine that wore his name if that's what it took to stop it from owning her. She promised to walk away even from the possibility of warmth if warmth meant disappearing. When the elevator arrived, it sounded like a gavel. The door closed between them with a softness that hurt. When he did the unthinkable in a room that measured men by what they could keep, he chose to risk losing it. The complaint went to regulators before the board could bury it. A dossier tracing forged authorizations to a corridor where the rival's shadow had been loitering for months. Allies blinked. Enemies grinned. The market prepared to punish courage as if it were incompetence. Beside him, the only person he trusted to say no sharpened the timeline and braced for reciprocal fire. Across the river, in a station that smelled like metal and hope, she played not for headlines, but for the handful of faces that slowed, for the small boy who stopped crying, for her own hands relearning what they were for. Their paths diverged into separate nights, both lit by the same stubborn vow: truth without purchase, love, if it ever returned, without terms. The city, for once, kept its distance and let them try. The market opened like a trap and snapped shut on anything that resembled faith, figures bleeding red across screens, while the chorus of certainty rehearsed its eulogies. In the glass tower, doors that once breathed at his approach now watched him with the polite patience reserved for the soon-to-be former, and the conference room smelled of ink and verdict. He understood what must be offered to slow the damage, and it tasted like metal. Step aside, accept an inquiry. Let the machine chew a piece of him. It could name accountability. Pride is loud, love is quieter. He signed where the lawyers pointed and felt a private silence widen behind his ribs. A vacancy shaped like a stage left by a canceled performance. Outside, winter bit the edges off sound. Sirens distant, headlines nearer. He told himself that survival wasn't the same as surrender. Then he packed a single bag as if preparing for weather he could not name. At the hospital, time lost its shape and became a metronome of beeps and fluorescent hum, each tick a reminder that bodies keep their own counsel. She counted breaths and syllables between alarms, bargaining with a ceiling that refused to bargain back. The guilt of almost accepting a poisoned rescue, gnawing like cold. Mercy is complicated when it arrives wearing the wrong signature. Refusal is costly when it's the only way to stay whole. A nurse's gentleness broke her in a good way, releasing tears she had scheduled for some future where crying would be efficient. She called the billing office, then an older teacher who still believed in the sustaining power of music, then a bar owner who paid in cash and shadows. Somewhere across town, the storm she had tried not to become part of gathered new names. Here, there was only breath, prayer without words, and the stubborn work of staying. He faced the microphones in a room engineered to flatter power and let it see itself, and chose a smaller register than spectacle allowed. The statement was plain and sharp. Step back, cooperate, protect the work and the workers, burn out the rot no matter where it hid. Questions arrived like hailstones, some legitimate, some built to bruise. And he took them without the lacquer he used to apply when the story mattered more than the truth. Somewhere in the answers he confessed a simpler heresy. That control had been his first language, and he was trying to learn a better one. The feeds clipped the palatable parts and spliced them to fit hunger. Still, a handful of eyes in the room softened, and that was its own currency. When the lights cut, the quiet behind the podium felt almost holy. And for one breath he let himself imagine a life measured by something other than quarterly weather. The audition room was a long corridor of taste, disguised as fairness. Chairs arranged like a jury. A screen erected to pretend no one cared who made the sound. She breathed in 4, out 6. Let the bow settle, and began with a phrase that remembered a rooftop wind and a vow to never be purchased. The first slip arrived not as error, but as grief. A tremor that flickered through muscle memory and asked for mercy. She refused to apologize with smaller playing. She widened, turned vulnerability into resonance. Let the difficult passage become a map of how a life bends and doesn't break. Behind the screen, the throat cleared. A pencil tapped, a whisper of approval or impatience. When the final note dissolved, the silence that followed felt honest, not cruel. Whatever verdict waited in envelopes later, she left with a spine that knew its height and a walk that didn't request permission. Night returned with its honest dark, and the city exhaled steam like dragons learning to be tired. He sat in a borrowed apartment that smelled faintly of paint and new beginnings, the contract to sell a slice of himself resting on the table like a dare. If he signed, the board would quiet, the wolves would feast elsewhere, and a necessary brightness would dim. She stood on a bridge where winter made water think about glass, clutching an offer for a touring gig that promised distance and solvency. The cost printed in small letters: absence. They had promised each other action over theater, And action now meant separation that wasn't a punishment, but a form of prayer. He wrote a letter instead of a text. She folded a scarf instead of a dream. Somewhere between them, the city held a space warm enough for a someday. For now, they turned their faces into the wind and chose to keep breathing. Night made a clean room of the small office, the kind of midnight that clarifies. Screens breathed cold light, while the city outside rehearsed its siren lullaby, and lines of numbers began to behave like a map. Once someone dared to treat them as a story. The trail that had been smeared by convenience grew legible under patience. A rerouted gift, a counterfeit authorization, a phantom server blinking from a building that loved mirrors. The shape of the enemy was not villainy so much as appetite wearing bespoke shoes. He felt the old instinct to call it fate and move on. The newer instinct said work. Beside him, resolve clicked through files like a metronome, and compassion kept time with anger until they sharpened each other. When the pattern finally locked, it was almost disappointing. Nothing cinematic, just small thefts compounded into harm. Proof printed with the heat of victory still cooling. They looked at the dawn and didn't flinch. The bus hummed like a thought she wasn't finished thinking, each stop a chance to change her mind, and each pass a decision to continue. The contract in her bag weighed less than the music in her chest, which had started to sound like a summons rather than escape. She counted the costs of staying, noise, rumor, exposure, and then counted the costs of leaving. Silence, where a voice had finally been heard. A message arrived without decoration. A location, a time, a proof that could unlatch the trap, chewing both their names. The city outside fogged the glass with breath and chimney smoke, all that ordinary survival. And she realized she was tired of surviving when there was room to live. She pressed the cord for the next stop and felt the small courage of that tug bloom into something larger. A stage awaited, not for applause but for accountability. She chose the harder door. The hearing room had the geometry of judgment. Mahogany angles, microphones like little knives, a clock that ticked in public. Spectacle hovered, hungry, but they starved it with order. Timestamps first, then logs, then the meek inevitability of arithmetic. Questions lunged and were met with calm. Insinuations flashed and fell dull against patient fact. The architect of the trap watched from his chosen shadow, rehearsed composure thinning as the paper chorus sang the same note from different throats. She spoke once, not about rumor, but about consent, about how philanthropy turned feral when it forgot its subject was people. Silence followed that wasn't empty. It was listening. When the chair finally used the word referred, it sounded like doors unlocking down a long corridor. They didn't celebrate. They stood, gathered their thin stack of victories, and walked out together into air that felt newly breathable, even if the storm still circled the block. In the ward where machines breathed with the unembarrassed intimacy of survival, the urgency that had filled the morning thinned to a quieter kind. The person in the bed slept the way the weary do, like a harbor after a storm, and the two at the foot of it stood in a truce shaped by gratitude. He spoke softly, syllables turned careful by rooms like this, of what he had loved more than control, and how terrifying that was. She spoke of the cost of independence when it calcifies into loneliness, how a spine can be straight and still lean. Apology was a heavy fruit, neither tried to force ripe. Instead, they watered the tree. The monitors counted compassion into beats, and the fluorescent afternoons softened at the edges as if honoring their awkward courage. When fingers finally threaded, brief, unclaimed. It wasn't a victory lap. It was permission to try without owning, to stay without trapping, to hope without debt. Evening borrowed the hush of a chapel and poured it into the rehearsal hall, where empty seats listened better than crowds. A single lamp cast a pool of honey on the stage, and in it they arranged a kind of testimony. Notes, yes, but also the spaces between them where trust learns to breathe. She tuned with the economy of someone who has earned her clarity, He set a recorder on the edge like an oath to transparency. The piece they chose was not glamorous. It was honest, built of phrases that arrive simple and depart changed. When bow met string, the room learned a new weather, and his stillness learned it too. By the final cadence, the future had not promised anything except the work of choosing each other again in the glare of tomorrow. The lamp fizzed, darkness settled politely at the edges, and they looked at the door that led to a vote the world would watch. Morning sharpened the skyline into a row of verdicts and funneled them toward a theater repurposed as a crucible, where ownership, rumor, and hope filed through metal detectors and tailored coats. The script for these gatherings was centuries old. Fire the lightning rod. Clap politely at the illusion of control. But someone had rearranged the furniture. Documents projected big enough for conscience to read. Timestamps crawling like ants. A microphone tuned for truth instead of triumph. He felt the familiar throb of the old language. Dominate, deflect. Rear up, and then recede beneath a steadier tide. She waited in the wings, not as ornament or alibi, but as a witness who had learned the shape of her own name. In the hum before the gavel, they did nothing cinematic. They breathed until their bodies agreed to be brave. When the chair called the room to order, the air carried the metallic taste of a storm about to break clean. He stepped into the wash of lights and refused the podium as if refusing a mask, speaking from the bruised center of a life that had been built like a fortress and was learning to become a bridge. No thunder, just architecture. A timeline that held, a confession without theatrics, reforms that seated power on purpose, sunlight on the books, an independent chair, a firewall between generosity and brand. The numbers did their plain work. The forged authorizations did their uglier work. The pattern resolved like a photograph in developer. He did not ask for absolution. He asked the room to love the work enough to outlive him if necessary. She watched from the wing and felt the music in her throat even before bow met string, because courage, when spoken without polish, vibrates like a low C you can't unhear. The vote devices waited. Little plastic oracles. The room forgot to cough. When the counter move arrived, it came in the bland packaging of a footnote. An email header, a server hop from a mirrored building, a donation rerouted through a shell with a name that sounded like a prayer. The room inhaled. The predator in the third row remembered to smile. Then the second slide landed with the patient elegance of a trap closing. The audit trail cross-hatched to a private office. The IP address like a fingerprint. The affidavit read into the record in a voice that didn't need to rise. He didn't gloat. He had finally learned the difference between victory and repair. She stepped forward not to crown a winner, but to mark the moment with something unbuyable, and the first phrase cut through the stale air, warm and exact. Stitching a wound without pretending it hadn't bled. Security shifted toward a man who suddenly preferred the aisle. Outside, sirens practiced impartiality. After the vote, the room exhaled into a softer weather. Not sunshine, not absolution, just oxygen. The tally did not hand back a crown. It offered a narrower road with guardrails he had requested. Power diluted on purpose. Oversight with teeth. A term that could end at the first tremor of arrogance. He accepted not like a man reclaimed, but like a steward on probation, grateful for the leash he'd asked them to keep on him. She found him in the corridor that smelled of dust and stage paint, and they stood inside the silence that follows hard mercy. There was an offer waiting for her. A seat in a section that had earned its authority, tours that would teach new cities her name, and a life here that would not ask her to become small. They spoke without hands, mapping a future measured in asks and answers. Love, if it was this, would be governed, not owned. Night returned, carrying a weather the city hadn't felt in months. Ordinary, on a rooftop that had learned their arguments and their truce. The air smelled of iron and thaw, and the lights below behaved like constellations pretending to be streets. They did not negotiate terms. They practiced them, standing at a distance that still felt like together. He spoke in the grammar of relinquishing, of choosing every day without guarantees, of leaving the door open so walking in could mean something. She answered in the music of presence, the kind that does not audition, the kind that sets a chair and warms a room and refuses to disappear, even when the cameras are hungry. When they finally closed the space, it wasn't a promise to never break. It was a promise to repair in daylight. Far below, traffic braided its long sermon of persistence. Above, a thin edge of dawn admitted it might be worth returning tomorrow.